Welcome to Biology, the scientific study of life. Populations are regulated by a complex interactions of biotic and abiotic influences. In this section, we will apply the theme of regulation to populations. There are two general questions we can ask about regulation of populations growth. First, what environmental factors stop a population from growing? Second, why do some populations show radical fluctuations in size over time while others remain more stable? These questions have many practical applications in agriculture. The objective may be to reduce the size of a pest population. If an introduced weed is spreading rapidly, what can be done to stop its growth? Why do agricultural pests have severe effects in some areas and negligible effects in others? Conversely, what environmental factors would create a favorable feeding or breeding habitat for an endangered species such as the humpback whale or whooping crane? Such questions, which involve population regulating factors, are at the core of management programs that have helped prevent the extinction of certain endangered species. Population change and population density. The first step is understanding why a population stops growing is to study how the rates of birth, death, immigration and migration change as population density rises. If immigration and immigration offset each other, then the population grows when the birth rate exceeds the death rate, and declines when the death rate exceeds the birth rate. Birth rate or death rate that does not change with population density is said to be density independent. In a classic study of population regulation, Andrew Wilkinson and John Herbert, plant population ecologists from the University of Wales, found that the mortality of Doyen Fiscoius grass is mainly due to physical factors that kill similar proportions of local population regardless of its density. In contrast, a death rate that rises a population density rises is said to be density dependent, as is a birth rate. Falls with rising density. Wilkinson and Harper found that production by Doyen Fiscoius declines as population density increases. Thus, at this grass population, the key factors regulating birth rate were density dependent, while death rate was largely regulated by density independent factors. Notice this figure shows models how a population may stop increasing and reach equilibrium due to various combination of density dependent and density independent regulation. Notice first one, both birth rate and death rate change with population density. Notice that. B, birth rate and changes with population, while death rate is contrasts. Notice C, death rate changes with a population density, while birth rate is contrast. This figure determining equilibrium for population density, or this simple model considers only birth and death rates as shown. Density dependent population regulation. Density dependent birth and death rates are an example of negative feedback. Without some type of negative feedback between population density and the vital rates of birth and death, a population would not stop growing, however, at increased densities. birth rates declines and or death rates increase, providing the negative feedback that halts continued population growth. Once we know how birth and death rates change with population density, we need to determine the mechanisms causing these changes, which may involve many factors. Competition for resources. In a crowded population, increasing population density intensifies intraspecific competition for declining nutrients and other resources, resulting in a lower birth rate. For example, crowding can reduce seed production by plants, and available food supplies often limit the reproductive output of songbirds. As as bird population density increases in a particular habitat, each female lays few eggs, a density dependent response, as shown here in this figure. An experiment in which female song sparrows living in high density conditions were given extra food. They did not suffer a reduction in clutch size. Territoriality. In many vertebrates and some invertebrates, territoriality may limit density. In this case, territorial space becomes the resource for which individuals compete. Cheetah, for example, as shown here, um, are highly territorial, using chemical communication to warn other cheetahs of their territorial boundaries. Oceanic bears such as gannets here. This figure often nests on rocky islands where they are relatively safe from predators up to a certain population density. Most birds can find a suitable nest site, but beyond that, there should few bears breed successfully. Thus, the limiting resource that determines breeding population density for gannets is safe nesting territory. Bears that cannot obtain a nesting spot do not reproduce. The presence of surplus or non-breeding individuals is a good indication that territoriality is restricting population growth, as it does in many bird populations. Health. Population density can also influence the health and thus the survival of organisms. If the transmission rate of a disease depends on a certain level of crowding in population, and the disease impact may be density dependent. Failed experiments conducted by Charles Michel, David Tillman, and James Gould of the University of Minnesota demonstrated that the severity of infection of plants by fungal pathogens is greater where the density of the host plant population is higher. Animals too can experience increased infection by pathogens at high population densities. Stephen Kohler and Wade Hoyland of the Illinois Natural History Survey showed that in case building caddis flies, stream dwelling insects, peaks in disease-related mortality followed years of high insect abundance. This study indicated that such disease-related mortality was largely responsible for cyclic fluctuations in the density of the insect population. Human pathogens can also show density-dependent infection rates. For example, tuberculosis, which is caused by bacteria that spread through the air. When an infected person sneezes or coughs, strikes a greater percentage of people living in high density sites than those in rural areas.